Good morning, everybody, or afternoon or evening, or whenever you watch the video afterwards. This is Data Architecture Day, sponsored by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. We are going to have a jam-packed 13 hours worth of sessions, give or take. There's some time for breaks in there, but we were going to be doing this for 13 hours, and to kick us off, I don't know who I could have better starting this than the man on the screen himself, Neil Hambly. You'd like to take it away?
Hi everyone, it's Neil here from the UK. It's good afternoon from me in the UK, good morning for those in the US. And if you're watching remotely from anywhere else in the world, good time frame for you. So thanks Kevin for the introduction. I'm going to be doing the first session of this amazing 13-hour kind of array of different sessions. So kind of look at the schedule, figure out which ones you're going to watch, all of them, of course. And we're going to get started with the Azure security one. So I'm going to start with some of my slides. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get going. If you have questions, please let us know, put those in the chat. We're going to take those throughout the session. We're going to start with a 50-minute kind of rough session. We're going to have about 5 minutes at the end, and then we're going to make the next presenter into the presentation mode for his session starting on the hour. I think that's Andy Lennon's going to be following. So let me share my entire screen, and I'm going to switch over to my presentation deck. So hopefully you should be able to see this in a second.
Yes, we're able to see it now.
Excellent. I know there's a slight lag, so I kind of have to say something and then wait for it. Okay, so up front, you'll kind of see a little bit about myself, a quick intro. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I have and own a Microsoft partner business around consulting, data analytics training. And I've done a number of different kind of DBA developer SQL-based roles over the years and presented, it says 150 events here, actually make that 450 events. I mistyped there. I've been running the SQL user group in the UK for many years, about 6-7 years. And I've also brought on some additional people to help me with that. And I just love presenting. I think I've done about 8 presentations in the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I'm out there delivering sessions all the time, as well as training. So if you want to know more about Beacon Intelligence, my company, I have a slide and I have it in my collection. What I'm going to do is quickly show you the collection. So on the the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see these collections. This is something in Edge, and I have a number from all the different groups and sessions I've done over the last few weeks. But today we're going to be doing the Data Architecture Day. And in here, I've got a number of resources I've put together specifically for this session. I'm going to close down my Beacon Intelligence one. I'll be using Microsoft Azure as some of our demos. So I'll be showing that and kind of creating some virtual networks and explaining why we're doing this and some of the configuration settings we can do. But kind of why are we doing this in the first place? What is the session that we're going to do? So let me kind of get started. And I'm going to go right to the top and I'm going to put up the specific session that we're doing today. And this is the Azure Database Virtual Network Strategy. Now, why is that important and why do we want to care about it in the first place? Well, if you're going to put SQL Server in Azure, one of the most common kind of first questions I get normally is, well, it's going to have internet access and it's going to be unsecure, etc. And the answer to that is, well, it won't, because we essentially, when we deploy it, we have a number of controls like firewalls and virtual networks and controls around who can come in and who can access those resources. But you're right, there could be a public IP address. But what we can also do is we can do it completely securely, where we're going to do only private IP addresses. So I'm going to kind of focus on some of the functionality. Now, I'm not going to go through everything you'll need to know to do everything, but I'm going to show you some great resources, hopefully that we'll be able to kind of take your time, go through those and actually explore the world of Azure and databases. So let's kind of have a look at what we're doing next. So this is my dashboard. This is my Azure environment. I already have provisioned up some resources in a resource group called DAD 2020RG. And in there, I've got my SQL servers, my virtual networks, my route table, and things like network security groups. And these concepts I'm going to explain as we go through in this next session. So
would it be possible to bump up the font size just a little bit?
Yep. Is that a little bit better? Just wait for it to come in.
Yeah, that is better. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. So I'll try and make it nice and large. I do have a monitor. I can kind of see the size and all that. So I'm going to kind of take us through securing your environment. There's a number of resources, and one of those resources might be, for example, the Microsoft Learn environment, where you're going to learn how to create your firewall rules. You're going to how to monitor those environments. So we'll come back to that towards the end of the session, because I'm going to get you started with the overview of Azure SQL Database and the security concepts around that. So we kind of scroll in, and hopefully I've made this nice and large. So you notice that there's kind of concentric rings around our customer data right in the center, the important stuff. And we have these kind of different perimeters, essentially, of data. We're going to concentrate on the very outside dark blue ring, the network security. There are other kind of areas that we need to maybe look at later on, but today we're going to concentrate on the network security. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at what's involved inside network security, and that is essentially some IP firewalls, firewall rules. So how do we configure who has access to these resources? We have the virtual network firewall rules, and that's different because essentially the IP firewall rules, it says who can come in from which IP addresses and what protocols and what ports, etc. And the virtual network is kind of the concept we're going to use to kind of hone in on where we're going to deploy our VMs and what access is allowed into that. So we're going to make it a lot more secure. And we're going to also use things like the service tags to actually specify that this is a SQL database type and that we want traffic only to go through to outbound traffic through the network security group, which we're going to explore and explain through the service endpoint for that. So there's lots of things that probably may be new to you if you've not come across those. We're going to show you and put a whole bunch of links as well for you to understand this better. Okay, so that's our overview, and we're going to cover that in detail today. There's some additional things that you might need to be aware of, like authentication and authorization, and how kind of it works with, Azure Active Directory, and kind of being able to look at role level security and other aspects. But today we're touching on just the network component on that. So let's have a look at the, this one here. So additional, we kind of just a couple of kind of images just to kind of give you a bit of a reference to what we're doing. And I also have some Visio diagrams, I think kind of that are a little bit easier to showcase the information. Just going to wait for that to come up on the screen. In here, you'll see we've got this Azure Virtual Network, this kind of dotted outside line. And inside of that is the resources we've deployed. These are the VMs, the firewall rules. We have something called a subnet. Subnet is essentially a portion of that virtual network, a number of IP addresses that we are allowing to have kind of certain resources deploy into. So we're carving it up into smaller spaces. And we may have a few empty kind of IP addresses at the end as well. That's probably a good idea to have those. Potentially even securing your jump box, your Bastion subnet. So we have this service called Azure Bastion, which allows us to kind of do secure socket jumps into that RDPs, etc. And we can control the access of who can get into that and what tools we can use. And it's using a private IP address rather than a public one. So we want to secure this down to who can come in. So, for example, the gateway subnet is allowing traffic in through a certain route, i.e. from maybe our on-premises environment into our gateway subnet inside of our Azure Virtual Network. We're then passing all that traffic through to the firewall. We've got to kind of have a zone there where we're kind of isolating all of the traffic through that firewall and allowing in certain traffic and maybe denying certain other traffic because we don't have those listed in those rules. We're going to then have maybe a number of subnets that are going to be made useful. And these essentially are then kind of cleansing what can go from one tier to the next. For example, subnet will go to maybe our web tier. And then potentially also will go to our business tier subnet. but the information from the web tier subnet will only be able to go to the business tier subnet, or saying it differently, the business tier subnet only allows traffic from the web tier subnet. And the data tier subnet, maybe the VMs with our information, our IaaS with SQL, is only allowing traffic from the business tier, etc. So we're kind of building these kind of perimeters and these kind of joints that we can kind of get the data to go for these different hubs. Let's go back to our main page. So we've got some of that information. We explore it and explain that in some of more detail. But essentially, the stuff that we are going to be focused on today is this Azure Virtual Network. A VNet is obviously some other way we normally pronounce it, shorten it. We like to have like acronyms very short. Gateways, what their purpose is and why they're kind of placed maybe in a separate own subnet. The Azure Firewall is very, very important. It's going to be generally in its own subnet, and also it's going to be how we manage access and in and out of our kind of a virtual network. Okay. The virtual network routes, this is kind of saying which routes we're going to take. And essentially, we can define a number of routes in our environments. And we won't go into a lot of detail today, but essentially that might be important for your configuration. I'm going to show you some templates that help with building those and setting those up from scratch and getting you started really quickly. But one of the core concepts around kind of security and improving things is this thing called a network security group. And this is to restrict that network traffic to just the TCP ports maybe we need. So for example, 1433, 11,000 to 11,999, if we're doing a redirect rather than a proxy. The Azure Bastion, as we said, kind of to get our RDP or SSH or remote controls into that without actually coming through the internet. And we kind of join in maybe our VPN site to site to get us up and running. So we're going to kind of build some of that today, show you what it looks like, and take questions later on once we kind of do that. And there's additional controls called role-based access controls, or RBAC is normally the way we kind of also refer to it. And this is doing fine level kind of assignment of requirements of security roles and assignments of that. We'll show you how that all works. So we do have a couple of links around the Bastion and what it is and how it all works, and kind of how this kind of improves the performance and security of the system, because we're just using private IP, so we're just on the backbone of Azure. And we also have the RBAC, which is the role-based access control. So in the access control section inside of our kind of our subscriptions or certain services, we can say who has what rights, and we can go and assign those users that specific role and give a custom role or a role assignment to get them up and running. So we're not going to go into too much detail today, but it's in my links to give you all that access. Okay, so let's have a look at what we have with kind of securing our environments. Okay, so first off, what we want to do is we want to essentially segment the controls of security in our environment. First off, the very top tier, we're going to be looking at subscription levels. That is who's paying for the service, but essentially also we're using it to say that's in a specific tenant, and that tenant belongs to which organization. You might have multiple subscriptions. I do in mine. But essentially, I'm going to then take my virtual network and assign it to a subscription by putting it through what's known as a resource group. So I've got my subscription. I will create my resource group. And in there, I will then have deployed my virtual network. Inside that, I'm going to have my VMs, my network security groups, or application security groups, whichever I need to deploy. And I'm also going to maybe have my firewall rule. So we're going to have lots of information around that. I'm going to take a brief moment. I'm just going to look at the chat window and just see what we have there and see if I can answer some of the questions. So give me a second. I'm just going to use my switcher to switch over to my controls so I can read the messages.
So yeah, big question here is, can you comment on what can be done to exfiltrate data? So if an attack can get root privilege from within security in Azure, could a process say suspend IP outbound rules, send data, restore the rules, and erase the logs? Or Perhaps you've seen internet commands for a bot from HTTPS result codes. So can a process make benign looking exfiltration of data? And asking this because most people focus on an inbound attacker, but this is also an interesting area.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you something called the Security Center. And this is where I'd probably go and set up all my monitoring and my security. So I can definitely hone down what my environments are, what I'm monitoring to what level. But if I come into this service, I have some overview. I can see all my kind of different services. And one of the things I'm going to scroll down to is kind of my secure score, my different subscriptions I have. I've got a breakdown of kind of all those and what the recommendations are. But I'm going to come into the resource security hygiene area. And if I scroll down, there's data and storage. So this is about kind of how my different SQL information protections might be explored, like SQL itself, the different services, storage accounts, other services. I don't have enough time really to go into a lot of here, but you will want to go and spend some time looking at the identity services. So defining who can log into your services, right? Which IP addresses, who can get into these VNets. We're going to secure that down. So we're going to have that really secure. But even so, somebody may still be able to get that username and password and information. So we can still monitor everything, and we can put that in a very secure place and use things like key vaults for our security, our passwords, etc., and do all of those that we need. There's lots of recommendations. There's lots of ways of helping kind of understanding how to solve things like your attacks, how to improve best practices by having use of Active Directory and monitoring all those services. So we don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but we'll cover this a little bit later on. But the Security Center is kind of where you can go and kind of look at all of that security related information, and also find out kind of how to do things what we call just-in-time access. So I give you access, maybe for a 2 or 3 hour window, you go in and do your work, and then the access is kind of removed, that grant is removed. What that means is there's no kind of surface area for you to attack. So we kind of will look at maybe if we have time at the end, the just in time, but that's going to be really helpful in trying to solve some of your problems there. I don't think I have too much set up at the moment in this example because I wasn't building it for examples around Security Center. But have a look. Cool. Any more questions at the moment, or do we want to? So I see a question about two-factor authentication. The more security you can put in place, the better. So if you are doing an admin type activity, definitely kind of have conditional access and two-factor authentication, or MFA, to specify that and get that done. You know, and it's really down to I'm controlling what I need, and if I'm using like Management Studio, I'm going to put that in a VM that's in my virtual network, and I'm going to be able to RDP into that. And then I'm controlling just the access from that VM into my services by using something like service tags. I'm on the right controls. Okay, cool. So let's go back to where we were. So we're looking at kind of this segmentation. We will go into more detail now, looking at the virtual network, the network security group, application security group, essentially the similar thing, and Azure Firewall. So kind of there's some links there, but we'll go down to the next section, which is also, by the way, I just remembered there was a new preview that's come out recently around the Azure Firewall. And essentially, let's kind of show you the screen a little bit here. If you've got multiple VNets, you basically may have a global admin or somebody's administrating those different regions and etc. And you want to control that a little bit better. This preview service at the moment, Firewall Manager, is going to help you understand that. We won't go into details about that, but essentially, especially you have multiple regions, this might be a useful hierarchical policy approach to doing things around the and also doing VNet to internet traffic filtering and other scenarios, etc. But we use what's known as a UDR, a user-defined route, and we're going to define that and put that inside of our virtual networks. But let's have a look at a virtual network. Let's have a look at what we have here. Actually, wrong one. So the one thing that we need to be aware of when we're kind of talking about connectivity into Azure services is something called an endpoint. And an endpoint essentially is a way of communicating with that service. And usually what we do is we go through a gateway. Now, the type of gateway that you're going to go through depends on if you're connecting from outside of Azure. So from internet kind of coming in, you're used by default proxy. And that will go through and look at the gateway and look up kind of what the IP address is based on the name of the service. We're going to show you that in a second. And we're going to connect to that through, say, Management Studio or Azure Data Studio. And we've got lots of these kind of connection points, and they're called endpoints. We'll be able to kind of get that through the proxy. If we're coming through the virtual network itself and have maybe a jump box, a bastion, or some other VM, we can go with the redirect. The redirect is a lot more secure because it's using a private IP address, not a public one. So coming back to that original question is, I want to remove public IP addresses because essentially, if I control, there's no access from a public IP coming into my SQL, that's a lot of my risk taken away from me. So we can set up private IP addresses using the redirect, and we got some rules inside of the virtual networks and gateways we can kind of set up that allow us to get all that working. So we're going to show you how to do that. But essentially, it's recommended you use the redirect. And what happens is you're coming in on port 1433. But the redirect basically says, go and use a port between the range of 11,000 and 11,999. You don't know what that is, but essentially it goes and looks up for you and takes it and redirects that traffic. So we go back up a little bit, you'll see that what happens, it comes in, it gets the redirect, it finds out, and then it redirects it to that specific node, that actual internal IP address of the SQL Server. So that's the one we want. But kind of, if you're coming from outside, coming from inside Azure, you'll have the redirect option. If you come from outside of Azure, you'll go through the proxy. So it's a lot more risk kind of averse to just have the redirect in play. Okay. So we're not going through all the details, but essentially we're trying to get to just that private IP address and take all the public ones out there. Okay, so scroll down a little bit further. And by the way, if you are unfamiliar with some of these kind of things like firewalls and stuff, there's some links I put together around some of the blog posts I know that have been coming out recently. There's a good one from Mike Wood at SQL Century One, S1, and he's doing a whole bunch of kind of what is the firewall rule. Essentially, there's actually two lists for SQL. There's a server level, which is actually the sys database server rules. So we're going to actually look at those. Let me kind of zone in a little bit. So the firewall rules are going to be specified when you go into the portal or you write some code. They're going to be run from that. Let me just kind of get rid of that dot there and just run this code. So if I zoom in a little bit, you'll kind of see the IP address here. And this IP address is just one single IP address. You see it's actually exactly the same start and end. This is my machine. And this got added through the portal when I did, create my client IP address. I'll show you how we did that. But I could go and create multiples in here. Now, we also have something called the database firewall rules, which is in the sys database firewall rules DM. And essentially, that is a rule that's actually associated with the database. So each individual database can have these rules essentially inside that. One of the reasons why you might want to do that is you can actually move that database from one server to another. But the database IP address or the firewall rules that you want to apply to that database could be more granular, and you want to have that inside of each of the databases. So first off, look at the server level, which is the firewall rules. Then it's going to look at the database level firewall rules and apply those if it needs to. Notice I don't have any database ones at the moment. Here's my database kind of demo SQL. I'm just going to zone in so you can actually see that a little bit better. And this was just created just to kind of have some a database I can connect to. So here's my server name, demo SQL Server DAD 2020. And then we've got the normal kind of .database.windows.net, which allows us to connect to that specific data. So this has been looked up in the gateway, and it's doing that proxy lookup, getting the IP address, and actually then doing the redirect of the traffic to that. Okay, so we'll show you where that is in the portal in a second. So one of the things that I often get when I'm teaching these in courses and doing kind of thing is, how do I get started with all this? There's lots to learn, Neil, you know, lots of things to maybe remember of. And you're correct, there is. So there's something called these Azure QuickStart Templates that I find will be really, really useful to have to showcase an ARM template, an Azure Resource Management template, essentially a set of JSON scripts that control what you're deploying. Let's have a look at some SQL ones. So I'm going to just type SQL in the window here. From the 877, we're down to 107, to do quite a bit. Let's go down to the bottom of that list and type this Microsoft.SQL, and we're kind of down to 32 templates now. If you look down, we're going through, look at some of these. It's like deploying SQL Server MA. By the way, we're doing virtual networks, and we're talking about Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL in a VM, and we're talking about Synapse Analytics, the old SQL Data Warehouse. Those all have public IP addresses. The managed instance only has private. So some of the stuff I'm talking about won't be relevant to the managed instance, and it kind of gets pulled out at some points. But if we go down a few places, you'll see that we have is, for example, create a SQL MI with jump box. So actually, I think there's another one down here that I wanted to show in number 2. Let's go and have a quick look at it. Where was it? It was in number 1, actually. It was number 1. I want to do the jump box. I want to do the virtual network one. Let's see if I can find it again. Where was it? I had it in my view, and then I've lost. Here we are. Create SQL MI with jump box inside a virtual network. So I want to kind of, you know what? I don't want to spend lots of time figuring it all out. Let me kind of just do that one. Clicking on that. This takes me to kind of the specific kind of template. Click on Browse on GitHub. Always a good thing to go and look at what actually is deployed. Look at kind of the scripts, etc. But this is also a useful thing. You can deploy to Azure and just fill in, wait for it to load, fill in the template with the information that you need. So what is the resource group that we might want to deploy it to? What's the location? Well, this is going to be bound to the location of where the resource group is. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to fill in some details. And you see it's all parameterized. I'm going to maybe fill in those details and deploy it. But if I go back a level and go back to where we were in the GitHub, let's see if I can go back a couple levels. Okay, click on that GitHub again. Click on the visualize. This often also gives you a bit of a view into what's actually available. Now, I will say it's terrible resolution when you go in. And generally what I do is I switch from the view there to my JSON script, and I'll see what the parameters are, and I'll see kind of what it's kind of defaulting to. And I can go and maybe change this and use that information. So I want to maybe look at the scripts and look at what it's doing and understand, and also maybe reduce the available number of maybe cores, so I can kind of limit things that's there, maybe the size of the kind of, if it's included in licensing or not. So I get to go and choose and figure this out, but I can go and deploy that ARM script and off I go. Okay, so let's go back a level. Maybe we just have to kill that one. There we go. Bring up a new window. So that's the QuickStart templates. So be aware that those are available and you can kind of use those. But let's kind of jump into our virtual network endpoints. And these virtual network endpoints are essentially a way of doing a direct connection to talk between different Azure services. So I'm going to go in and connect to my gateway. From my gateway, I'm going to talk to my SQL database or SQL data warehouse or storage, whatever it is. I've got these different ones available to me. Okay. So why are we doing these endpoints rather? What's the purpose of those? Well, essentially, it's a way of us securing down to just have the services that we need to communicate with other services. So I want to have a very secure virtual network, which is that little container. And in there, I'm going to have a couple of VMs, and my VMs are going to talk to my SQL databases. And I may have a web app as well, that's talking to the database or the VM, etc., that being hosted. Okay, let's kill that for a second. So those are kind of essentially what we're trying to talk about is something like this, where we've got our environment, we've got our virtual network, our VNet. We've got our IP addresses that we're defining with our CIDR, so the commonest kind of internet kind of domain routing kind of abbreviation. So 10.0.4.0.24, that's telling me how many IP addresses are, the 10.0.1, etc. So I've got all my subnets inside of my larger virtual network. Okay. We also have some other examples of this, where we're going to look at maybe an N-tier application, where we have a number of different tiers. And sorry, this doesn't scale very well, so I'm just going to try and scale it a little bit on the browser there. So that's maybe about the best I can do. Give it a little bit more sizing. So the application gateway subnet, then a management subnet for my jump box in there, my web tier, business tier, my databases are in my data tier, and I also maybe have my Active Directory subnet as well. So this is kind of how I probably want to design my different resource groups, and also where there is load balancers, how they're load balancing, what resource groups I'm using. I have maybe my DDoS, so my distributed denial of service to stop that traffic that shouldn't really be hitting coming in. And those public IP addresses, I want to kind of remove those a little bit and replace them with a secure private channel with a site-to-site VPN and other services that allow me just to go in on a private IP address. So I'm going to have a kind of DNS service kind of provision as well as part of some of the services I'm going to provision up. Okay, let's have a quick look at where we were. Okay, so by the way, you kind of see that I have a large volume of kind of links. I'm not going to get through everyone, but essentially what we want to do now is we want to look at the firewalls and firewall networks. So we kind of looked at a few screens here. Let me go and show you what my Azure environment looks like and how we spin these up. So I'm going to go to my dashboard. My dashboard is a good way of kind of for me to kind of zone out a little bit. One more, there we go. To have quick access to the resources. So all the resources that are in a specific resource group. And I've also got a couple of those down as little kind of blades as well. And I'm going to go into my SQL Server, one I've envisioned up. I click on the link. It's taking me to the main blade. And I'm going to show you some of the real estate here. So first off, one of the most important areas, if I zoom in and kind of highlight the firewalls and virtual network area, this is what you want to click on. You want to click on that blue link, and we're going to go into the firewall settings. Look at the database server name here, the demo SQL Server DAD 2020 .database Windows Net. That's the server. So this is the SQL Server instance, but we're going to have databases we're going to have deployed within that. We could have multiple of these, but this is firewall settings for this server. Okay. So click on the link. And this essentially then, I'm just going to take you through the real estate a little bit on this one, is we have denied public network address. Yes. I really want to have that denied, but I'm going to have to set things up first. So I'm going to leave that for no for now. But this add client IP address. So let me kind of just remove, and I'll kind of show you that this is me. So this is my client IP address. You can see that we have that client IP address loaded here, and it's got really nice naming convention being used. So I could go and kind of it's kind of Neil's desktop. I could kind of name that a little bit. probably good thing to do. But let's say I kind of didn't have this in place. Let's kind of remove that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save. I'm going to now test connectivity to my SQL Server database without this rule being in play. So let me go back and let me let me run that. You can see that we're running. I'm just going to disconnect. I'm going to connect. I know probably you can't see a huge and I now have the problem of I don't have a firewall. It does actually kind of say, you know what, you can call it, add it here, and but I'm going to go and do it from the portal. So let me kind of zone out, cancel, come over to my portal, and right at the top you'll see it says client IP. Let's kind of kick on that. It's added it in. I'm going to give it a nice naming convention. Neil. Okay. Save. And a few seconds later, that's going to be saved, and we're going to have that all those warnings. Get rid of those. Okay. Now, what I have is I have in that SQL Server, I have that one firewall rule, and I'm going to go and test that again. And now connectivity is fine. So this is basically coming. This is run that query. Notice that. Oh, sorry, you need to run it without highlighting a certain piece of code. I'm coming from Neil's desktop. This has basically been added into the sys.firewall rules from the portal. If I want to add database firewall rules, I have to use T-SQL. I'm not going to fully script that out today, but there's some links on how to do that. Essentially, if I wanted to, in this specific database, add in a database firewall rule, I could do that. There's none at the moment in there, but I will be able to look at that if I wanted to add those later on. Okay. See where we are time-wise. Excellent. We're good on. So now, if I scroll down a little bit further, notice we have a default for the connection policy. Probably leave it at default, but what you really want to do, you could actually just say it needs to be redirect only, which means it never will allow internet access. It has to be redirect. It's going to be a private IP address. Allow Azure services and resource to access this server. I really want that to be a no. What that means is I've got to have to specifically specify which services have which access. Having the yes kind of says a bit of a trust to other Azure services that are sitting there ready to go and kind of being used. Okay, but further down, I have this virtual network kind of capability. So if I scroll in, just kind of zoom in a little bit, you'll see that it's got a rule name, sorry, I say a virtual network, which one I've actually assigned it to, what the subnet is also, and what the IP address range is, and is the input enabled. So I kind of have those services. I've got some things about subscriptions and other stuff, but I kind of see, I can just remove that, but I can also add existing and create a new one. If I want to create a new one, essentially it's going to bring up a new blade and say, okay, you want to create a virtual network, create it. So if you don't really have it, you can actually build it there and then straight inside of your kind of environment. So I could give it a new resource group name. Actually, I'm just going to use the existing. I'm going to give it a new virtual network name. So VNet demo DAD 2020. And this is the important thing. You want to put your virtual network in the same location of where you want to deploy your resources. Now, you can do a bit of network peering and kind of between runs, but this is important. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to do next IP addresses. This is where I get to choose my CEDAR. So 10.0.1, sorry, 1.0 and maybe 24. Actually, I've already got one that's actually already kind of there. So it was actually 0 and then 1. So what I was doing here is I'm going to add essentially another set of IP addresses, another virtual network that's in a different virtual network kind of range. But that's saying that actually overrides with that virtual network. So kind of, I can also do an IPv6. I'm going to give it a subnet name. I'm going to call this Neil's demo subnet. And I can give it a subnet. So I always want to make this smaller than what's actually there. So let me kind of just put one on there, 0.1. Oh, too many dots there. 0, and let me kind of make it 27 there. So what I've got is just 27 addresses. I'm also on the services. I'll probably want to pick the SQL, Microsoft.SQL, to say what type of service tag and service I'm going to have. I'm going to add that. So essentially what I could do is add in these additional subnets, build those, and be off I go. So kind of here, so we kind of just, was it one? Again, I don't want to, so I don't want the range there. That's fine. Okay. So I'll go to security. I'd probably want to have the firewall enabled. If I have one, give it a name. So demo firewall, give it an address space, make it public, make that public. So the firewall I do want to have public, but I kind of will build up this information and end up with kind of what I need there. So in this case, I'm just going to go with the disabled. I'm just kind of end up with review and create. Oh, I was missing some information. Let's have a look what it was missing. So one of these didn't like. Oh, here we go. So let's kind of remove that one for a second. Okay, and there we are. Should be able to go through with that. Did I miss something? Okay, I'm going to skip on that one because I've something I'm not seeing on the screen now. But I have done a virtual network previously, and in here I've created my subnets, and I can see that I don't have a firewall associated with this virtual network right now. But if I wanted to create a virtual network, I could. And there's some additional kind of DNS stuff, so I could create my own custom DNS. I could do peering. I could look at the service endpoints that I basically provisioned and see which subnet it's associated with, etc. So all of the kind of stuff I needed to set up that kind of get me up and running. So I'd have all this information set up, and that's my virtual network. I'm going to deploy my VMs in and my SQL database, etc., inside this DAD202. So quick look at where we were. So we're down here. Okay. So when I have my virtual network, the next thing I'm going to do is I want to put my virtual net rules in play. Okay. So these are server level and they're for a specific region. So a US region or a European region. Okay. They are at the server level, not database level. You want the database level, you're going to put your own firewall rules in that. But essentially, we are having these rules applied to say who can do something. And there's also some RBAC stuff we kind of did. Let's have a look at some of the limitations. It depends if the network security group they're going to also deploy and attach to that network security, that virtual network rather, is allowing connectivity to that SQL database and which IP addresses. We kind of want to use the service tags to do that. So we're going to show you how to set that up in a second. But we can do this also by PowerShell or by Bash script, and we have the ability. If you're not really familiar with that stuff, go and look at some of the templates. They kind of make a lot of that simplified for you. And there's also a bunch of links I'm going to show you as well as how to do that, as well as some Microsoft Learn resources. Okay, so I've created my resources. I'm going to also potentially have storage and other information. I want to use identities and authorization, maybe managed service identities. So we're not covering that today, but look at managed service identities for your SQL servers and create your database scope credential. Use that so you're not kind of making use of user accounts to connect into these services. So you're securing it down. But again, we're securing the services and the network first, and then we're securing things like the authentication and authorization as a second level of kind of security. So there's more steps in here on how to do that. But essentially, we need to, we can also we can also do a VNet firewall rule without turning on the service endpoints if we wanted to do that. So we have to go through these steps to kind of do that. But essentially, there's a couple of ways of securing your SQL Server, and one is through endpoints, which I recommend, but you can also do it without endpoints and just kind of at the firewall server level through the firewall. So if you want to kind of do that, we can go and look at the, let's actually just bring up the portal again for a second. Let's go to the top and show you where kind of the information is around the day. So first off, when I went into my resource group, I had a bunch of those resources. Going to minimize a few of these so we can kind of see this a little bit better. We have all these different resources, but one of the entries in there is going to be a SQL database. Now, this SQL database here, I can see which server it's applied to. I can see where it's located. I can see it's online. If I click into it, this is where I also have the ability to set my server firewall rule inside of the blade for that specific database. So it knows it's on a server. It also makes access to that server firewall. So I could do it in a few different places. It ends up being the same thing at the end of the day. But if I scroll down a bit further, you notice there's other kind of things around, maybe like the advanced data security. So there's additional services we might want to put in play, like, let me kind of just move that over a little bit, like advanced threat protection, which may have answered some of the questions earlier about, and I haven't looked at the chat window, so I'm kind of leaving most of those questions towards the end to go through and go back and look at these. But look at kind of what you deployed, how we monitor it, for example, with the monitor tool, and look at kind of network. So we can actually go and look at the network capability and look at some of the services we have. And look at so let me just filter for that resource group that we are currently involved in. And I can see I've got no alerts, no kind of issues at the moment, but this is where maybe I would start seeing that more information. So under databases, at the moment there's only SQL, so Cosmos DB, there's no SQL, but hopefully I think that's coming soon. But the virtual machine is the layer that we would basically look at the compute and look at what's available from a kind of a configuration standpoint, and also from monitoring those environments. I don't think anything has been up long enough for me to look at the moment. Yeah, I'd have to come back and look at that with some data. But we can go and look at the security center. We can look at the monitor tool. We can kind of bring in lots of ways of looking at the data and fixing, like the quick fix for the advanced data security. I can click on that quick fix. It's going to say, let me just click on it. It's going to say which ones do I want to apply it to. I'm going to apply it to this specific server. So I'm applying it to the server, the managed instance, that is. Rather than the server, it's a managed instance. It has a bit of a charge. That's fine. I've got a bit of resource to apply to it. But these hot fixes and quick fixes are really going to be kind of easy to do and apply. So use your security center, use your monitor to figure out traffic, but have somebody that knows what they're doing. And as a reason, I've actually stopped that service being deployed through my controls when I was doing a security section. So I need to remove that. But essentially, these services could be easily provisioned and set up and secure. So you need to look at a high level view, like the visual, and say, have I got the right traffic? Is it coming in? How do I look at this data tier subnet right at the right hand side and get it secure? Who should I allow access to? What ports, what IP addresses, what ranges, and how do the routes traffic through? So when I'm looking at it and building my virtual network, I need to have a view of this. I need to probably draw this out at some point, put some values in, and then test that these IP address ranges work and the subnets work, but also the ones that are outside of this don't get access. So I'm going to kind of need to test this out as well at some point to get me, and you might have a more evolved version of that, something like this, where we're going to have additional kind of complexity with high availability for SQL Server. and potentially even a hybrid deployment where some of your SQL servers on premises, some is in Azure in terms of the availability groups, etc. And how do you put all that security around all of this? Good question. And it's kind of one that you would have to sit down and kind of look at the traffic pathways. So the routing that you're going to have in place, etc. And potentially even to the point where you're actually doing a multi-region deployment. So I've got a primary region, maybe in the US, and I've got a secondary region, could be in Europe. And I'm using Internet Traffic Manager, I'm using gateways, I'm using my jump boxes. I've got all my different subnets and virtual networks deployed. And I can do virtual network peering between those in order to communicate between a different virtual network to the next. So I can have that overview of all those services. So get familiar with virtual networks, subnets, firewall rules, things like load balancers will kind of be part of like the firewall itself. As your firewall is load balance itself. And there's other things like the application security groups and network security groups we need to deploy in order to really secure down what we're trying to do. Okay, so let's have a kind of round off on where we are on some of these views. One sec. So again, there's a lot more resources that I haven't. I'm just going to click through a couple of these and show you that there's, for example, if you want to understand your subnetting. Now, what is the maskings? What's the CIDR drop for that to give me 32 addresses or thing? Always keep a few IP addresses spare in your virtual network. So when you carve it with subnet, keep a few. You want to use private IP addresses more than public. We want to use the service endpoints as best we can and kind of use those, and service tags is also another way of referring to that. There's some sample documents here about how to go about setting these up, how to do the different things, and what's the impact of these. They're going to have additional resources or different approaches for your Azure SQL database, data warehouse or Synapse Analytics, and your managed instance. There's kind of two different kind of approaches because one has public IPs or PIPs and one doesn't, like the database managed instance. But we have different ways of kind of securing that very nicely. So just be aware of what type you're deploying. We've done that one. I think we've done that. So there's also some nice little videos you might want to watch there, 15, 20 minutes long, that go through the steps on how to do some of this. Again, you've got abilities to maybe look like PowerShell, for example, to look at what you have and get a full listing of the addresses and communicate with that. And then towards the end, we've got some new services like the Azure Private Endpoint. I believe this went GA'd a couple of days ago. So this is something that actually then allows you to have a fully private linked service with a DNS configuration, everything else with it, to kind of this is how it kind of works. It explains the flow of kind of how you're doing things. So I don't have time to go through all of that, but essentially you could set this up as well. This is another more secure way of doing things. So here's a couple of different kind of ways of setting that up, and how it all kind of looks up the DNS addresses, gets the right IP address, the private one, and forwards that on, and then you're doing just private traffic. And I think there's a little video by Anna, so kind of just click on that. And Rohan around kind of actually delivering this new service. So kind of that's I think came out a few days ago, actually 2 days ago, yeah. And the managed instance itself, if you're going to do managed instance, there's a few links here. So all the links I've got in here are going to be available. I'll make those available to Kevin and he can share them out. So we have a few minutes left to answer a couple of questions. So Kevin, let's go over to the chat window and have a look and answer a couple of questions before we let Andy in.
Sure. I've primed the pool, so we're going to see if anybody takes the bait. I think I just mixed metaphors, but it's early enough in the day for me for that.
Yeah, so Well, if there are any questions that we don't have time to pick up, people can get in touch with me. And how do they do that? Well, there's a couple of ways. We kind of just so the first way is Twitter, and that was my timer, so I was pretty much on the money. So you can get through to me at my Twitter, and I'll just go and actually bring up, click my profile. So it's Neil_Hambly is my zone in a little bit better. There we go. So Neil_Hambly is my Twitter handle. Feel free to connect to me on that. Find my name in LinkedIn, send me a question. neil@beaconintel.co.uk is going to be my email address. So I can kind of put that in the links, but you can kind of just ping me on Twitter and I'll kind of get back in touch with answers to questions. Last thing to say, really, before I end up is thank you very much for accepting my submission. It's kind of one of the subjects that don't get a lot of kind of interest sometimes, but it's kind of one of the most important ones, especially in today's world where security is really important. So kind of introducing those concepts of network security groups and virtual networks and kind of private IP addresses and firewall rules. Fascinating stuff, lots to learn. And hopefully I've given a little bit of an insight into that world. But if you have more questions, let me know. And that is me done. So Kevin, thank you very, very much. I look forward to seeing some of the other sessions later.
Great. Thank you, Neil. This was a very interesting topic. I'm glad we were able to get it on the agenda. So what we're going to do as we switch over to our next presentation, the next presentation will begin in just under 13 minutes. So what I'll do is that I will stop the stream for probably about 30 seconds. Just hang out, the stream will start back up. You shouldn't have to refresh your browser or anything. But that way, that'll allow me to stop the video recording for Neil and then get it started for our next speaker, Andy Leonard, who's going to talk to us about the SSIS development lifecycle and Azure DevOps. So stay tuned. We'll be back in intermission mode, and as soon as we're ready for the next session, we'll go over to Andy.